Lauren Harper had never planned on starting her life over at 38, but after the brutal end of a long, draining marriage, she realized she needed distance. Not just from people, but from the expectations that had quietly crushed her for years. She found her new beginning in a place most people would overlook. An old, slightly weathered property nestled near a private pond, surrounded by rough shrubs and gnarled oaks, tucked away from the neatly trimmed perfection of suburban life. The house had belonged to a distant great-uncle she barely remembered meeting as a child, and when it unexpectedly landed in her lap through a probate notice, it felt like the universe offering her an escape hatch. Without much ceremony, she packed her things, sold what little tied her to the past, and drove across 3 states until the city lights faded behind her, and the endless gray asphalt melted into winding country roads lined with tall grass. From the moment she stepped onto the property, Lauren knew it wasn't going to be easy. The place had charm, sure. Creaking floorboards that whispered stories of a forgotten era, walls that smelled faintly of cedar, a porch wide enough for a dozen rocking chairs. But it also came with an unspoken resistance, a sense that the land remembered everyone who had tried to tame it. Still, she embraced the challenge, pouring her energy into restoring the house and letting the yard grow more naturally, encouraging wildflowers along the pond's edge and leaving thickets of bushes where birds could hide. To her, it was not neglect but care, a way to let the land breathe again after years of rigid landscaping. What Lauren did not anticipate was the reaction from the so-called neighborhood committee, an informal but deeply entrenched group of longtime residents, most notably led by Karen Mitchell. Karen was the kind of woman who wielded social power like a blunt instrument. She had lived in the area for over 30 years, and she treated the community standards as her personal gospel. The first meeting with Karen happened less than 2 weeks after Lauren moved in. When she found the woman standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed over her considerable chest, a tight-lipped smile barely masking disapproval. Karen introduced herself without pleasantries and immediately began explaining the expectations for maintaining the view of the pond, which, according to her, included removing any tall vegetation, repainting the porch in HOA-approved neutral colors, and despite the fact there was no formal HOA in place, and trimming back all natural growth to no more than 10 inches in height. Lauren, polite but firm, declined to make any immediate changes, stating that her land was privately owned and that she preferred to follow natural conservation guidelines instead of cosmetic standards. Karen's expression hardened immediately, her smile evaporating into a tight grimace. There was no shouting, no threats, just a quiet, heavy warning. "It's not wise to isolate yourself from the community, dear." Lauren simply nodded, pretending not to hear the underlying menace. What she didn't realize was that this moment marked the beginning of something far worse than a simple neighborly disagreement. It was the spark that would ignite an escalating battle, one where the line between personal vendetta and petty committee politics would blur until it was impossible to tell which was which. In her determination to maintain her independence, Lauren had unknowingly challenged a woman who thrived on control. And Karen, as she would soon learn, was willing to go much further than anyone could have reasonably predicted to reassert her dominance. It began subtly at first, the way rot does under the surface before the wood finally collapses. Lauren noticed the first signs when she found an anonymous note wedged into the crack of her front door, written in perfect, looping cursive, advising her that continued neglect of community standards could result in formal complaints. The letter was unsigned, of course, but it reeked of Karen's particular brand of thinly veiled hostility. Lauren tossed it without a second thought, unwilling to fuel whatever petty crusade Karen had decided to launch. Yet the notes kept coming, sometimes left on the windshield of her truck, sometimes taped to her mailbox, always anonymous, always dripping with the same performative concern. At first, Lauren brushed it off as harmless harassment, the kind of nuisance you ignore until it burns itself out. She had bigger things to worry about: securing the foundation of the house, repairing the cracked dock by the pond, and cleaning up decades of debris left to rot beneath the trees. But Karen was persistent, and her methods began to escalate in ways Lauren couldn't dismiss. One afternoon, after a long day spent hauling broken branches and reinforcing the dock posts, Lauren returned from a trip into town to find that her private property signs had been ripped from the fence posts and thrown into the brush. In their place, someone had planted a small, neat placard reading, "Community Access Pathway." For a moment, Lauren stood there in the gravel driveway, the keys to her truck dangling from her hand, staring at the absurdity of it. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a deliberate attempt to erase her authority over her own land. Lauren removed the sign carefully, documenting everything with photos, and contacted her lawyer, who advised her to formally log the incident with the county records office. It was an annoying but necessary step, the kind of bureaucratic battle that wore down even the most determined. She completed the paperwork without fanfare, believing she had successfully put a legal wall between herself and whatever nonsense Karen was planning. Lauren soon realized that Karen's ambitions were not confined to passive-aggressive notes and sign theft. A week later, while working near the pond's edge, she noticed unusual mounds of dirt near the waterline. At first, she thought perhaps an animal had been digging, but as she approached, she saw the truth. Someone had dumped heavy, jagged rocks into the shallow banks, forming crude berms that redirected the natural water flow back toward her yard. It was a deliberate sabotage, designed to cause slow flooding over time, to turn her wild garden into a swampy mess and render her property unstable. Furious but composed, Lauren documented the rocks and the disturbed earth with meticulous care, photographing angles, measurements, and watermarks before making another call to her lawyer. This time, they agreed it was no longer just harassment. It was an act of vandalism, and possibly trespassing with intent to cause property damage. A report was filed, but Lauren knew enforcement would be slow unless she caught someone in the act. That night, she sat on her porch, listening to the crickets buzz and the frogs call out from the pond, wondering just how far Karen was willing to go. The answer came faster than she expected. Within days, Lauren began noticing strange cars idling near the end of her driveway. She would glance up from her work in the garden to see unfamiliar faces watching her for long, uncomfortable moments before driving off without a word. Calls to the sheriff's department resulted in polite promises to increase patrols, but no real change. It was psychological warfare, pure and simple, and it gnawed at Lauren's nerves in a way she hadn't anticipated. She kept her routines, refusing to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, but she couldn't deny the slow creep of unease that burrowed into her chest. To stay ahead of whatever was coming, she quietly increased her defenses, installing better locks, adding motion-sensitive lights around the pond perimeter, and updating her insurance policy to cover acts of vandalism and malicious property damage. She also gave a spare key to a trusted neighbor, an older man named Mr. Wallace, who lived a few houses down and had already expressed his disdain for Karen's constant meddling. Despite these precautions, Lauren knew the real danger was that Karen didn't seem to fear consequences. Every move she made suggested a belief that she was untouchable, that the community would close ranks around her out of habit or fear or apathy. And so it was, on a humid Saturday afternoon, when the sky hung low and bruised with distant storms, that Lauren found herself facing the culmination of Karen's escalating campaign. Hearing the low, irregular rumble of a large engine, she stepped onto her porch just in time to see an old, battered pickup truck, rattling, rusted, and clearly overloaded, barrel down the gravel road toward her property at alarming speed. The truck didn't slow as it reached her fence line. It tore through the thin wooden posts like they were paper. Lauren barely had time to shout, stumbling back as the vehicle charged across the yard, tearing up grass and scattering clumps of soil in its wake. The truck hit a slight incline near the pond and launched upward, the front tires spinning uselessly in the air before the heavy weight of the engine dragged it nose first into the murky water with a spectacular splash. There was a moment of eerie silence, broken only by the sound of water gurgling as it filled the cab of the truck. For a breathless heartbeat, Lauren simply stared at the scene before her, unable to fully process what had just happened. Then, from the slumped figure behind the steering wheel, she saw a familiar flash of floral print. Karen, flailing awkwardly as she tried to push open the door, her massive frame struggling against the rising water. Shock turned to grim practicality as Lauren pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed emergency services, her fingers trembling with the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. As the dispatcher calmly took her information, Lauren's eyes never left the surreal image of Karen, sputtering and cursing as she waded out of the half-submerged truck, drenched and furious like some deranged caricature of a suburban tyrant defeated. By her own recklessness, the authorities arrived faster than Lauren expected, not because they prioritized small-town emergencies, but because a drenched and screaming woman wading out of a pond was bound to cause a stir. 2 deputies pulled up, tires kicking up dust as they braked hard at the edge of her broken fence line. Lauren stood to the side, arms folded tightly across her chest, the phone call to emergency services still fresh in her mind, the operator's calm voice contrasting sharply with the chaos unfolding before her. "Karen, soaked to the bone and seething with rage, flailed her arms at the officers the moment they stepped from their vehicle, her words pouring out in a half-coherent rant about traps, illegal barriers, and booby-trapped landscaping designed to entrap unwary citizens. It would have been laughable if not for the seriousness in the way one of the deputies motioned Lauren over, separating the two women with professional detachment. Lauren, aware that appearances mattered more than ever now, kept her tone even as she calmly explained what had happened. The repeated harassment, the removal of signs, the sabotage by the pond, the sudden, unprovoked vehicular assault across her property. She presented the documentation she had been methodically gathering over the past month. Photographs, incident logs, copies of the anonymous notes, offering them up like ammunition in a quiet war she had been forced to fight. One deputy took the papers with a nod of acknowledgement, leafing through them with an increasingly furrowed brow, while the other radioed for a tow truck to retrieve Karen's submerged vehicle. Meanwhile, Karen continued her histrionics, insisting that she had every right to access the pond and that Lauren's property was in violation of community safety standards. A phrase she repeated like a mantra, as if saying it enough times would make it true. The deputies, to their credit, handled the situation with more patience than Lauren would have thought possible. After gathering preliminary statements from both women, they explained that an official report would be filed and that charges could be considered pending an investigation into the damage. Karen, upon hearing that she might face consequences, shifted tactics immediately. She clutched at her chest dramatically, claimed she felt faint, and demanded to be taken to a hospital to check for injuries allegedly sustained during the impact. Lauren watched her be loaded onto a stretcher and into an ambulance with a numb sort. A fascination, the absurdity of it all nearly too much to process. When the property finally cleared out, the tow truck hauling Karen's battered truck out of the pond, the deputies departing with copies of Lauren's carefully prepared evidence, Lauren found herself standing alone in the wreckage of her yard. Deep ruts scarred the once soft earth where the truck had gouged its way through. The remains of her fence lay splintered and scattered like matchsticks, and near the edge of the pond, several of her young saplings had been flattened beyond saving. It wasn't just property damage. It was an invasion, a violent statement that boundaries meant nothing to someone like Karen when pride was on the line. Lauren didn't waste time wallowing in anger. She went inside, retrieved her phone, and contacted her attorney. She outlined everything that had happened in precise detail, her voice steady even as her hands shook from the aftermath. Her lawyer, a pragmatic man with little patience for theatrics, advised her to prepare for two simultaneous tracks. First, filing a civil lawsuit for trespassing and property damage. Second, reinforcing all correspondence through official legal channels from that moment forward. No more verbal warnings, no more casual notes. Every action would be logged, notarized, and formalized. It was exhausting to think about, but Lauren understood it was the only path forward if she wanted to protect what was hers. The days that followed were not quiet ones. News of the incident spread faster than Lauren would have liked, fueled by the natural gossip that thrived in small communities. Some neighbors, emboldened by schadenfreude, came to gawk at the tire tracks and the broken fence, offering thinly veiled sympathy while fishing for more details. Others, those wary of Karen's influence, avoided Lauren altogether, afraid of being seen choosing sides. Even the local feed store cashier clumsily hinted at the story while ringing up Lauren's purchase of new fence posts and heavy-duty wire. Karen, for her part, did not retreat into embarrassment as Lauren had half hoped. Instead, she doubled down, filing a formal complaint with the so-called neighborhood committee, accusing Lauren of maintaining a dangerous and non-compliant property that allegedly led to her near-fatal accident. Copies of Karen's complaint were slipped anonymously into mailboxes around the area, painting Lauren as an irresponsible, combative new resident who had no respect for community traditions. The narrative Karen pushed was clear. She had been a victim, not an aggressor, and Lauren was a reckless outsider who needed to be reined in. Lauren responded exactly as her attorney advised. She said nothing publicly, issued no emotional rebuttals, made no comments to the neighbors. Every interaction was filtered through legal documents, every communication logged with clinical precision. She fortified her property boundaries even further, installing heavy timber fencing, locking gates with coded keypads, and posting new signage that cited specific trespassing statutes under state law. She didn't do it out of fear. She did it because every step reinforced her position in the inevitable legal showdown to come. But she also knew Karen wouldn't be satisfied with a smear campaign. People like her needed to win, needed to crush opposition utterly, and Lauren could feel the tension mounting like a thunderstorm just beyond the hills. There were small signs of what was coming. A contractor she had hired to help rebuild the dock suddenly canceling without explanation, a delivery of construction materials inexplicably delayed and then lost en route, phone calls that rang once and hung up when she answered. Minor incidents easy to dismiss individually, but taken together, they painted a chilling picture of coordinated disruption. Late one night, while reviewing security footage from the newly installed cameras along her perimeter, Lauren spotted something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. At around 3 a.m, a figure had approached the gate at the end of her driveway, a bulky shape moving with furtive, hurried steps. The figure rattled the gate, tested the locks, and, finding them secure, retreated back into the shadows without breaching the property. The footage was grainy, the angles poor, but Lauren had little doubt who it was. She saved the recording, made copies, and sent it immediately to her attorney and to the county sheriff's department, attaching a statement outlining the escalating pattern of harassment. Lauren understood then, with a clarity that cut deeper than anger or fear, that she was not just dealing with a neighborly spat, or even a campaign of harassment. She was facing a siege, a slow, grinding assault intended to wear her down, isolate her, and force her into submission or flight. But Lauren Harper had already survived a broken marriage, financial hardship, and a life rebuilt from ashes. She wasn't going anywhere. She would see this through, not because she wanted a war, but because walking away would mean giving Karen exactly what she craved: absolute, unchecked dominance. And Lauren had learned the hard way that bullies, once given ground, never stopped taking. The incident with the gate rattler marked a turning point, not only for Lauren's strategy, but for her entire outlook on the situation. Up until that moment, there had still been a part of her, however small, that believed this could all end with enough patience, enough documentation, enough stoic refusal to engage. Now, watching the replayed footage again under the harsh light of her desk lamp, she understood that this was no longer a battle of paperwork or local reputation. It was a question of endurance, of who would break first, and Karen was not just playing to win. She was playing to exhaust, to isolate, to crush. Lauren responded accordingly. Without waiting for a direct threat to escalate into something physical, she took immediate action. Her attorney filed for a restraining order against Karen based on the cumulative evidence: the destruction of property, the physical intrusion with the truck, the sabotage by the pond, the stalking behavior captured on camera. It was a bold move, one that made her pulse race with anxiety even as she signed the documents, because in towns like this, everyone knew someone who knew someone, and retaliation often came in forms more subtle and corrosive than an outright confrontation. Still, she pushed forward. The paperwork was served without drama. Karen was away from home when the deputy delivered it, and it was left pinned to her door. But the silence that followed was deafening, a pause pregnant with malice. It was during this uneasy calm that Lauren received an unexpected ally. Mr. Wallace, the quiet older man who lived 2 houses down and had kept largely to himself throughout the ordeal, knocked on her door one evening, his face drawn and serious. He didn't mince words. He had seen enough. The truck incident, the furtive figures skulking around late at night, the way certain neighbors suddenly stopped making eye contact. He told her with the dry resignation of someone who had lived too long under small-town politics that Karen had a long history of bullying newer residents, especially those who didn't immediately fold to her will. She had simply never pushed anyone this hard before. Lauren listened carefully, grateful for the information but cautious, knowing that even the best intentions could backfire in a community where loyalty shifted with the wind. What Mr. Wallace offered next, however, wasn't idle gossip. He handed Lauren a manila envelope containing copies of old neighborhood meeting notes, informal but detailed, where Karen had been cited multiple times by other residents for overstepping her authority. Organizing compliance visits without legal backing, threatening fines that had no basis in law, and, most damningly, manipulating property records during an informal survey conducted years ago to redraw unofficial neighborhood boundaries in her favor. Lauren's hands trembled slightly as she leafed through the papers. Here it was, a clear pattern, a history of manipulation hidden beneath a surface of civic involvement. Armed with this evidence, Lauren and her attorney filed a secondary motion to not only strengthen the restraining order, but to formally request an investigation into the activities of the neighborhood committee itself. It was a move that shifted the entire dynamic. Now Karen was not simply facing a private grievance, but potential public exposure. For the first time, Lauren sensed real fear in the way the committee members reacted. The smug glances disappeared. Conversations dried up when she approached. A few of the more opportunistic neighbors even offered her guarded nods of encouragement, as if sensing the shift in power and wanting to align themselves with whoever would ultimately prevail. Karen, unsurprisingly, did not take this reversal lightly. Within days of the new filings, Lauren found a fresh volley of passive-aggressive tactics aimed at wearing her down. Utility workers showed up unannounced, claiming they had orders to inspect her septic system. A city code inspector left a bright orange notice taped to her door, citing vague property condition concerns that mysteriously disappeared after Lauren's. Attorney called the municipal office and demanded clarification. There were no official fines, no formal accusations, just an endless stream of small, harassing acts designed to make her life inconvenient, expensive, and demoralizing. Yet despite these pressures, Lauren felt a shift within herself. Each petty act, each attempt to destabilize her resolve, only reinforced her commitment. She stopped seeing herself as a victim fighting to survive and began to recognize herself as a rightful defender of her home. Someone who was not simply reacting, but methodically reclaiming every inch of her rightful autonomy. She refused to let Karen redefine her, refused to accept the subtle intimidation as the price of living in peace. Every time she patched a fence, replaced a vandalized mailbox, or calmly logged another incident for her legal record, she was building something stronger than mere resistance. She was building proof that she belonged exactly where she was and that no amount of social pressure or low-grade harassment would drive her out. The culmination of this internal transformation came late one night when Lauren, unable to sleep, stood on her back porch watching the moonlight ripple across the pond's surface. She heard the distant hum of a vehicle idling beyond her property line, an old habit of surveillance Karen had cultivated over the past weeks. Instead of feeling fear or rage, Lauren felt a strange, steady calm. She turned off the porch light, returned inside, and quietly documented the incident, adding it to the growing file she and her attorney were preparing. No confrontation, no emotional outburst. Just another cold, meticulous entry into the legal record that would one day bury Karen under the weight of her own misconduct. Lauren knew then, with absolute certainty, that the tide had turned. The battle wasn't over, far from it, but the balance of power had shifted. Karen could scheme, could lash out, could try to tighten the screws through bureaucratic harassment. But the law was slow and methodical, and in the end, it moved with the kind of inevitability that no tantrum could stop. Lauren was no longer just surviving. She was winning, and the realization settled into her bones like armor. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't underestimate her opponent. She simply tightened her defenses, prepared for the next assault, and promised herself that when the final blow came, it would be delivered not with fury, but with the quiet, relentless hand of justice. The uneasy truce shattered on a damp Wednesday morning when Lauren received a certified letter delivered directly to her door. She had grown used to official-looking envelopes arriving like clockwork, each one carrying a new, hollow threat dressed up in legalese. But this one immediately felt different. It bore the insignia of the county courthouse. The real thing this time. Not some fabrication from Karen's private stash of scare tactics. Inside was a notice informing her that Karen had filed a civil suit alleging that Lauren's modifications to her property, specifically the replanting of wild vegetation around the pond and the installation of new fencing, had created a public nuisance, impaired community access to natural resources, and endangered the neighborhood's aesthetic value. The absurdity of the charges would have been laughable if the consequences weren't spelled out in cold, stark terms. If upheld, the lawsuit could force Lauren to pay fines, remove the improvements at her own expense, and, in a worst-case scenario, face court-ordered sanctions. Lauren sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread before her, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to feel the weight of exhaustion. Not defeat, she wasn't broken, but a deep, aching tiredness that no amount of coffee or adrenaline could cure. She called her attorney, scheduled an emergency meeting, and prepared for another round of fighting. What became clear during the meeting was that Karen's strategy had evolved. The new lawsuit was not about truth. It was a calculated move to bleed Lauren dry through procedural harassment, force her into endless legal fees, and exhaust her resources before any real court decision could be reached. It wasn't about winning on merit. It was about making the cost of resistance so unbearable that capitulation would seem like the only rational choice. Lauren, however, had anticipated this. Months earlier, when the first notes began to appear and the sabotage started escalating, she had quietly restructured her finances, shifting savings into protected accounts, securing a line of credit to cover legal fees, and setting aside funds for precisely this kind of drawn-out confrontation. She wasn't rich, but she was prepared. She authorized her attorney to file a countersuit for malicious prosecution and abuse of process, citing the mountain of documented harassment and the obvious retaliatory nature of Karen's lawsuit. Two could play the game of procedural warfare, but Lauren intended to play it cleaner, smarter, and with iron patience. Karen's reaction was immediate and vicious. The very next evening, a construction crew appeared at the far end of Lauren's driveway, claiming they had been authorized by the neighborhood committee to begin a beautification project that required partial access across Lauren's land. There were no permits, no authorization notices, just a clipboard-wielding foreman and 3 workers already unloading equipment. Lauren didn't argue. She didn't shout. She walked back inside, locked her door, and called the sheriff's department, reporting unlawful trespassing and unauthorized construction. Deputies arrived within 30 minutes, forcing the crew to pack up and leave under threat of citation. Once again, Lauren documented everything, carefully compiling another stack of evidence to present in court. The pattern continued, each move slightly more desperate than the last. An anonymous complaint was filed against Lauren with the Environmental Department, accusing her of polluting the pond through unauthorized agricultural activities. Inspectors arrived, professional and courteous, but found no violations. Her natural plantings were not only legal but encouraged under local conservation guidelines. Then came sudden interference with her utilities. Her water supply mysteriously disrupted for hours at a time, her internet connection unstable with no technical explanation. The providers shrugged off the issues, citing unforeseen technical difficulties. But the timing was too precise to be coincidental. Through it all, Lauren kept her head down, her records meticulous, her communications filtered strictly through her attorney. She refused to rise to the bait, to give Karen any footage of emotional outbursts or erratic behavior that could be weaponized in court. Meanwhile, Karen continued to unravel. Unable to provoke Lauren into making a misstep, she turned increasingly reckless. She organized community meetings that were little more than rallies against Lauren, distributing flyers filled with distorted accusations and half-truths, but cracks had begun to show in her facade. Neighbors who once tolerated Karen's overbearing presence began to question the wisdom of aligning themselves with someone so clearly obsessed. Several longtime residents distanced themselves quietly, murmuring apologies to Lauren when passing her at the grocery store or waving sheepishly when they drove past her property. The tide of public opinion, slow and ponderous as it was, had begun to turn, and Karen's increasingly shrill tactics only accelerated the shift. Lauren remained cautious. She understood that popularity would not win her the legal battle. She remained focused on what mattered: the evidence, the process, the steady, grinding forward motion toward resolution. The court date for the initial hearing loomed closer, and Lauren and her attorney worked late into the nights preparing briefs, compiling exhibits, and rehearsing testimony. Every incident, every invasion, every false complaint was logged and cross-referenced until their case became an unassailable wall of documented truth. 1 week before the hearing, Karen launched what Lauren recognized as her final desperate play. Late one night, Lauren woke to the sound of heavy machinery idling somewhere near her property. She pulled on jeans and boots, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped carefully onto the porch. What she saw froze her blood. A large backhoe, its engine rumbling low, was parked just beyond her fence line. 2 figures, poorly illuminated by the moonlight, were attempting to dismantle the newly installed fencing, presumably to clear a path for the machine to cross onto her land. Lauren didn't hesitate. She stepped back inside, locked the door, and called the sheriff. Deputies arrived in force this time. 3 vehicles, lights flashing silently in the dark. The would-be trespassers scattered like rats, abandoning the machine where it stood. When questioned, the backhoe driver claimed he had been hired anonymously for a private demolition job, but produced no paperwork, no contract, no verifiable orders. The deputies impounded the machine and filed a full incident report, which Lauren's attorney promptly folded into their existing case. No direct proof tied Karen to the attempted destruction, but the pattern was undeniable, and the court would be asked to weigh not just isolated events, but a continuous, escalating campaign of harassment and intimidation. Lauren watched the deputies work, their radios crackling in the cool night air, and felt no triumph, only a cold, grim sense of inevitability. Karen had overreached again, and this time the damage to her credibility would be permanent. As the deputies left and the silence returned to her battered but still standing home, Lauren realized that the worst was likely yet to come. Desperation made people reckless, and Karen had already shown she was willing to sacrifice anything. Dignity, reputation, even legal safety, in pursuit of her vendetta. But Lauren also understood something else, something deeper. Karen's power, once so imposing, now hung by a thread, fraying a little more with each failure, each recorded lie, each abandoned scheme. And when that thread finally snapped, it wouldn't be in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, humiliating collapse, witnessed by a community that would remember, long after the court cases ended, exactly who had truly threatened their peace. The day of the hearing dawned heavy with the kind of thick, oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the town like a physical weight. Lauren arrived early, dressed in the simple, clean lines of muted professionalism, her paperwork stacked neatly in a leather binder, her attorney walking beside her with a quiet, confident gait. The courthouse itself was modest, a squat brick building that had seen generations of local disputes pass through its doors. But today it felt charged with a tension that prickled against Lauren's skin the moment she stepped inside. She saw Karen across the small lobby almost immediately. Gone was the blustering suburban queen. In her place stood a woman who looked bloated with rage and panic. Her hair frazzled from the humidity, her floral dress clinging awkwardly to her frame as she barked at her own legal counsel, a thin, harried man who looked as though he had already lost the fight before it even began. Lauren said nothing as they passed each other. She simply looked ahead, her spine straight, her steps measured, exuding a calm she did not entirely feel but knew she had to project. The courtroom was small, more municipal than majestic, and filled quickly with a scattering of curious locals who had caught wind of the feud and come to witness the fallout. Lauren could feel their eyes on her as she sat at the petitioner's table, could hear the faint rustle of whispered speculation as Karen took her seat across the aisle. She focused on her breathing, on the steady, rehearsed cadence of facts and evidence, not on the noise or the undercurrent of petty drama. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air, called the court to order, and the proceedings began with a dry recitation of the facts. Karen's attorney stumbled almost immediately, presenting a shaky narrative built more on insinuation than evidence, weaving a tale of community disruption and emotional distress without offering a single verifiable document to back up the claims. When Lauren's attorney rose to respond, the difference was like the contrast between crumbling plaster and solid stone. He spoke methodically, presenting a meticulously organized timeline of harassment, vandalism, trespassing, and malicious interference, each point supported by photographs, certified reports, witness statements, and official complaints filed with the sheriff's department. Lauren sat silently as exhibit after exhibit was entered into the record, each one stacking higher the mountain Karen would have to scale to justify her actions. When it came time for witness testimony, Mr. Wallace took the stand, his voice steady as he described the pattern of Karen's behavior, not only toward Lauren but toward other residents over the years. He spoke without embellishment, his quiet dignity lending weight to every word. Other neighbors, emboldened by the proceedings, also came forward, their accounts painting a damning portrait of a woman who had long abused the fragile social structures of the community for her own ends. Then came Karen's turn. She was called to testify, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Karen shuffled to the stand, casting a withering glare toward Lauren as she settled heavily into the witness chair. Her attorney coached her through a series of questions designed to elicit sympathy, but Karen's natural bombast soon overwhelmed any strategy. She railed against Lauren, against outsiders, against what she called the erosion of traditional values. Her voice rose, her gestures grew wild, and at one point she even jabbed a finger toward Lauren, accusing her of orchestrating a campaign of lies to tear the neighborhood apart. The judge's gavel cracked sharply, silencing the outburst, but the damage was already done. The room saw Karen not as a victim, but as a bully cornered by her own hubris. In cross-examination, Lauren's attorney dismantled Karen's claims with clinical precision, forcing her to admit she had no direct evidence of wrongdoing, that her assumptions were based on hearsay, and that she had taken it upon herself to correct what she perceived as violations without ever seeking legal clarification. By the time she stepped down, sweaty and visibly trembling, Karen looked diminished, a caricature of the power she once wielded. The final arguments were brief. Lauren's side rested on the solid ground of facts, patterns, and consequences. Karen's side, thin from the beginning, collapsed entirely under scrutiny. When the judge delivered her ruling, the words cut through the heavy air like a blade. The court found in favor of Lauren Harper on all counts. Karen Mitchell was ordered to cease all contact, direct or indirect, with Lauren, to pay restitution for property damages, to reimburse Lauren's legal expenses, and to participate in a mandatory mediation program aimed at curbing her abusive behavior, under threat of criminal contempt if she failed to comply. There was no explosion of noise, no dramatic collapse, just a low murmur from the gallery and the thudding heartbeat Lauren could hear in her own ears. Karen sat frozen, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and impotent rage, while her attorney whispered frantically into her ear. Lauren stood when her attorney touched her arm lightly, gathered her things, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. She moved like someone stepping out of a burning building, not running but steady, scorched but not broken. Outside, the heat wrapped around her like a second skin, thick and suffocating. But Lauren tilted her face to the sun and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the enormity of the moment settle into her bones. The fight was not over entirely. There would be appeals, bureaucratic slowdowns, maybe more subtle acts of retaliation. But the battle that had defined her life for so many months was, for all practical purposes, decided. She had not only defended her home, she had exposed the rot festering beneath the polite veneer of her community, and in doing so, she had reclaimed not just her property, but her right to live without fear, without apology, without bending to tyranny. Disguised as tradition, Lauren knew better than to celebrate too soon. She would remain vigilant, would continue to defend her space with the same steady hand that had carried her through this ordeal. But for now, standing in the blistering heat of a summer afternoon outside a courthouse that smelled faintly of old wood and new justice, she allowed herself one small, hard-won moment of peace. She had endured. She had fought smart, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without the weight of someone else's hatred pressing down on her chest. In the weeks following the court's decision, the slow, grinding process of repair began, not just to Lauren's property, but to the fragile fabric of her life that had been torn apart by Karen's campaign. The restitution payments ordered by the court trickled in under protest, each check sent through Karen's attorney, each one a bitter, silent acknowledgement of defeat. Lauren used the funds not for anything grand or ostentatious, but for practical restoration. Rebuilding the broken sections of her fence with stronger materials, reseeding the torn-up parts of her yard, reinforcing the dock with treated timber that would withstand both storms and sabotage. She worked alongside the contractor she hired, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in mud, determined not just to fix what had been damaged, but to leave no weakness exposed for anyone to exploit again. The neighbors, those who had once averted their eyes or whispered behind curtains, began to change their behavior as well. Some approached Lauren with cautious friendliness, offering help with repairs or simply exchanging nods of acknowledgement, where before there had been tense silence. A few even apologized, awkwardly and without expectation, for not speaking up sooner, for allowing Karen's bullying to go unchecked for so long. Lauren accepted these gestures without bitterness, but without forgetting either. She knew better now than to mistake politeness for loyalty or proximity for friendship. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild, and she would not rush it. Karen, meanwhile, faded from view with an almost pitiful rapidity, stripped of her perceived authority, burdened by legal sanctions, and ostracized by a community eager to distance itself from scandal. She retreated into her home and, eventually, away from the neighborhood altogether. Rumors circulated that she had moved to a relative's house in another county, that she was taking time to heal. But Lauren paid them no mind. Karen's absence was enough. The machinery of harassment had ground to a halt, not with a bang, but with a long, wheezing collapse. And for Lauren, that silence was its own kind of victory. One evening, as the last of the summer heat began to break, and the cicadas sang their harsh twilight songs, Lauren stood by the edge of the pond, watching the reflection of the setting sun ripple across the water's surface. The air smelled of fresh earth and wood smoke, and somewhere nearby the low hum of life, crickets, frogs, the distant bark of a dog, wove itself into the fabric of the evening. She let herself breathe it in, deep and slow, feeling the weight that had pressed against her chest for so long finally begin to lift. She had not sought this fight, had not wanted to make a stand, but when forced to, she had met it with the quiet, stubborn resilience that her life had taught her. She did not think of herself as a hero or a symbol, just a woman who had drawn a line and refused to let anyone cross it, no matter the cost. As darkness settled over the land and the first stars blinked into existence overhead, Lauren turned back toward her house, her home, and felt a small, hard ember of pride kindle in her chest. She had survived, she had endured, and most importantly, she had won, not by destroying someone else, but by refusing to let herself be destroyed.